In 2003, a 14-year-old kid in rural West Virginia followed a blood trail into the woods behind his family's property and found something sitting against a fallen oak with a steel trap still clamped around its leg. It was not a bear. It was not a wolf. It stood taller than his father on two legs, had a canine head broad enough to fill a doorway, and watched him with eyes that should have belonged to something capable of tearing him apart in seconds. The dogman did not move. The boy did not run. And for the next 20 years, he kept walking back into those woods without telling a single person why. What he carried out of that forest eventually, in a shoebox hidden in his garage, would become some of the most haunting photographic evidence I have ever come across on this channel. So before we get into this, make sure you hit subscribe and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. I read every single one. Thanks. Now I need to be honest with you about something. I have covered hundreds of dogman encounters on this channel. Sightings, attacks, stalking behavior, territorial aggression, government cover-ups. The vast majority of those stories follow a pattern. Someone sees a dogman, the dogman is terrifying, the person escapes or doesn't, and the encounter ends with fear and unanswered questions. That is what the data shows. That is what the reports consistently describe. Dogman encounters are defined by adrenaline and dread. They are survival stories, but every once in a while, a story crosses my desk that does not fit the pattern at all, and I have to decide whether I'm going to ignore it because it's inconvenient or whether I'm going to follow it because it might be true. I've been doing this long enough to know that the stories that challenge what we think we know are usually the ones worth telling. This story came to me through a chain of contacts that started with a retired wildlife officer in Pocahontas County, West Virginia. I had interviewed him for a previous video about unusual predator activity in the Monongahela National Forest. We'd stayed in touch after that, trading emails about sighting reports and strange track findings in the area. Months later, he reached out and said there was someone I needed to talk to, a man he'd known for years, a man who had been carrying something alone for 2 decades and was finally willing to share it because the thing he'd been protecting was gone. The officer told me point blank that he wouldn't have made the introduction if he didn't believe the man was credible. That got my attention. I spent 3 weeks going back and forth before the witness agreed to speak with me. And even then he set conditions. No real name, no exact location beyond the county, no publication of the photographs without his explicit approval on each individual image, no sharing coordinates or landmarks that could lead someone to the property. I agreed to all of it without hesitation. What he told me over the course of 4 separate conversations, totaling almost 9 hours of recorded audio, changed the way I think about dogman behavior in ways I am still processing months later. The witness grew up on a property that backed against a hollow thick with second-growth hardwood in the southern part of the county. His family had owned the land for 3 generations. His grandfather had logged part of it in the 50s, and the forest had grown back dense and tangled, the kind of Appalachian woodland where rhododendron thickets can swallow a person 10 feet from a trail, and the understory stays green even in January. The property line ran along a creek that fed into a larger drainage. And beyond that creek, the land climbed steeply into ridges that nobody maintained or visited. His father hunted deer on the lower slopes every November. Nobody went past the second ridge. There was no reason to. The terrain was brutal, the brush impenetrable in places, and cell service died at the tree line. The witness described himself at 14 as a lonely kid. His parents were going through a rough stretch that had been building for years. He had one older brother who had already left for the military and didn't call often. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles down the road, and the school bus ride was 45 minutes each way through hollows that looked the same from one bend to the next. He spent most of his free time in the woods. He knew the trails, the game paths, the places where salamanders hid under flat rocks in the creek. He knew which logs held grubs and which trees dropped the first walnuts in September. The forest was his world, the place where the noise of the house couldn't reach him. He told me that without those woods, he probably would not have survived his childhood emotionally. I believe him. I've talked to enough people from rural Appalachia to know that the forest isn't just scenery there. It's therapy. It's shelter. And in this case, I think the woods saved him twice, once from loneliness and once from something much darker, though the second time it came in a form nobody would have predicted. In November of 2003, he was walking the creek bed after school when he found a blood trail on the rocks. Not deer blood, which he knew well from helping his father dress kills since he was 10. This was darker, almost black, thicker in consistency, and the volume of it was wrong. It pooled in the crevices between stones and ran in streaks where something had been dragged or had dragged itself upstream against the current. He followed it for maybe a quarter mile into a section of the hollow where the canopy closed overhead and the light dropped to almost nothing even in the afternoon. The rhododendron pressed in from both sides. The air smelled like wet earth and iron. The blood trail led to a downed oak that had fallen across a shelf of rock during a storm years before, creating a natural shelter underneath where the trunk bridged a gap in the stone. And that is where he saw the dogman for the first time. The dogman was sitting with its back against the trunk. One leg was extended and the other was pulled close to its body. A steel leg-hold trap was clamped around the extended leg, just above what the witness described as an ankle joint. Though the anatomy was not quite canine and not quite human, the trap was old, rusted, the kind of thing that gets set and forgotten in these mountains. The chain attached to the trap had been snapped clean, not cut, which tells you something about the force this dogman was capable of generating even in a wounded state. A length of the chain trailed along the ground. The dogman's fur was dark, almost black with hints of charcoal gray along the chest, matted with blood and leaf litter. Its chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths that made a faint whistling sound. Its eyes were open. They were amber, the witness said, bright and alert despite the obvious pain, and they tracked him the instant he stepped into the clearing. He told me he froze. Every instinct told him to run. The dogman was enormous even sitting down. The shoulders were as wide as a doorframe. The arms were thick and corded with muscle visible even through the fur. The head was unmistakably canine, with a long muzzle, erect pointed ears, and a jaw that could clearly generate crushing force. The hands, and he insisted on calling them hands because that is what they were resting on the ground beside its hips, fingers spread against the rock, claws visible and dark. But the dogman did not growl. It did not bare its teeth. It did not lunge or shift its weight forward or do any of the things that a predatory animal does when a potential threat enters its space. It watched him with an expression the witness struggled to describe across all four of our conversations. He kept coming back to the same comparison. He told me it looked like the face of a person in a hospital bed who sees a stranger walk into the room and doesn't know yet if that stranger is there to help or to cause more pain, exhaustion and alertness at the same time, hope and suspicion existing in the same look. He stood there for what he estimated was 3 full minutes. Neither of them moved. He could hear the dogman breathing, and he could hear his own blood pounding in his ears, and those were the only sounds in the hollow. Then he took a step back, then another. The dogman's eyes followed him, but its body stayed absolutely still. He turned and walked back down the creek. He did not run. He told me that running felt wrong, that it would have broken something fragile that had formed in those few minutes, something he couldn't name but could feel as clearly as the cold November air on his face. I asked him what he meant by that. He was quiet for a long time before he answered. He said it felt like an agreement, not spoken, not conscious, not something either of them decided, but real. The dogman had chosen not to attack, and he had chosen not to flee, and in that mutual decision something had passed between them that he could not name but could not deny. He went home. He did not tell his parents. He ate dinner in silence while his mother and father argued about money in the kitchen, and he sat in his room afterward and stared at the wall until his hands stopped trembling. He did not sleep that night. The next morning before school, he packed a canvas bag with a bottle of hydrogen peroxide from the bathroom cabinet, a roll of gauze, a pair of his father's heavy wire cutters from the tool bench in the garage, and a package of deer jerky from the pantry. He told me he didn't make a conscious decision to go back. His hands packed the bag while his brain screamed at him to forget the whole thing. The hands won. After school, he walked straight past the house and into the hollow without stopping. The dogman was still there. The position had shifted slightly, the body angled more toward the approach path as if it had been watching the trail. The trap leg was swollen, and the fur around the steel jaws was crusted with dried blood that had turned almost black. The dogman watched him approach with the same calculating stillness as the day before. Its ears rotated to track his footsteps. He set the bag down 6 feet away and opened it slowly so the contents were visible. Then he sat on the ground, cross-legged, the way he sat in the woods when he was alone, making himself as small and unthreatening as a 14-year-old could manage. He told me he sat there for over an hour, not moving, not speaking, barely breathing, just being present. The dogman watched him the entire time. Its breathing was rough and there was a wheeze in it that worried him even then. Infection, he thought. Tetanus, maybe. He didn't know animal medicine, he just knew the sound was wrong. As the light started to fade and the hollow went gray, he pushed the package of jerky forward with his foot until it was within the dogman's reach. Then he stood slowly and left. The next day the jerky was gone. The dogman had shifted position again, pulling itself tighter against the fallen oak. He repeated the process, sat for an hour, left food, talked to the dogman in a quiet voice, not saying anything meaningful, just letting the sound of his voice become familiar. He told me he talked about school, about a teacher he didn't like, about his brother's last letter from overseas. The dogman's ears moved when he spoke, tracking the sound, and the tension in its body seemed to ease slightly when his voice stayed low and even. The third day, he brought more peroxide and the wire cutters. This time he sat for 2 hours. The dogman's breathing had improved slightly, but the leg looked worse, swollen to nearly twice the size of the other. Near the end of the second hour, the dogman extended its trapped leg toward him, not quickly, not aggressively, slowly, deliberately, with a carefulness that the witness said looked almost polite, the way you might extend your arm toward a doctor you don't fully trust, but know you need. He told me his hands were shaking so badly he could barely operate the wire cutters. He crawled forward on his knees, every nerve in his body firing, acutely aware that his face was now within arm's reach of a dogman that could crush his skull with one hand. He got both hands on the trap, positioned the wire cutters on the spring, and squeezed with everything he had. The spring gave. The jaws fell open. The dogman pulled its leg back with a speed that startled him and made a sound that the witness described as somewhere between a whine and a low guttural vocalization, not threatening, more like relief expressed through vocal cords that weren't designed for subtlety. The dogman tucked the freed leg against its body and rested its head back against the oak trunk and closed its eyes. He said it was like watching someone finally exhale after holding their breath for days. He left the peroxide and gauze beside the fallen oak and walked home with his legs shaking so badly he had to stop twice and lean against a tree. I want to pause here because I know what some of you are thinking. This sounds impossible. This sounds like fiction. A 14-year-old kid nursing a dogman back to health in an Appalachian hollow, like some kind of cryptid fairy tale. I get it. I had the same reaction when I first heard it. I almost didn't pursue the story. But here's what kept me listening. The witness did not tell this story like someone performing. He told it like someone confessing. There were long pauses where I could hear him breathing on the other end of the call. There were moments where his voice broke and he had to stop and collect himself. There were details that no one fabricating a story would think to include, like the way the dogman smelled, which he described as wet dog and copper and something underneath that was not animal and not human but somewhere in between, something musky and warm that he said he could still smell in his dreams. He described the texture of the fur near the wound, how it was coarser than the rest of the body, like the guard hairs on a German shepherd but thicker and oilier, almost waterproof. He described the sound the trap made when the spring released, a sharp metallic ping that echoed off the rock shelf. These are not the details of a fantasy. These are the details of memory burned into someone's nervous system by the most intense experience of their life. Over the next 2 weeks, the Dogman healed. The witness visited every day after school, rain or shine, hiking the 1/4 mile to the fallen oak in the failing light of late November. He brought food. Jerky at first, then raw meat he took from the chest freezer in the garage when his parents weren't paying attention. Chicken thighs and ground venison, and once an entire package of pork chops that his mother spent 2 days looking for. The Dogman ate everything. The witness watched the Dogman eat and noted how it used its hands to hold the food and tear it, not shoveling food with its mouth the way a dog would, but manipulating pieces with its fingers, pulling sinew apart, discarding pieces it didn't want. The fine motor control was remarkable. By the end of the first week, the Dogman was standing, testing weight on the injured leg with careful experimental steps. By the middle of the second week, it was limping around the shelter area, marking a perimeter. By the end of the second week, the shelter was empty. The witness told me he felt a pit open in his stomach when he found the spot vacant. The matted down leaves where the Dogman had lain were still visible, a few dark stains on the rock shelf. The gauze he'd left was shredded into pieces. He sat down on the rock and felt the kind of emptiness that has nothing to do with hunger. He thought that was the end of it. He thought the Dogman had healed and moved on and vanished into the deep forest, and he would spend the rest of his life wondering if any of it had really happened. He told me he cried that afternoon, sitting alone on the rock, and he was not someone who cried easily. 3 days later, he was sitting on the rock shelf near the creek, just sitting the way he always did after school, watching the water move over the stones, and he heard movement in the rhododendron thicket behind him. Not the rustle of a squirrel or the crash of a deer, something heavy moving deliberately through the brush. The Dogman stepped out of the thicket about 30 feet away. It was standing fully upright. The injured leg showed a visible limp, but the Dogman was mobile and alert, and its eyes locked onto him immediately. It stood there and looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them moved for several minutes. The creek ran between them, and a mockingbird called from somewhere in the canopy, and neither of those things seemed to belong to the same world as what was happening on that rock shelf. Then the Dogman sat down on its haunches, the way a large dog sits, but adjusted for the proportions of a body that was clearly built to stand and walk upright. The witness said that was the moment he understood this was not over. The Dogman had come back. It had healed, and it could have gone anywhere in 10,000 acres of unbroken forest, and it had come back to him. That pattern held through the winter of 2003 and into the spring of 2004. The witness would go to the woods after school. Sometimes the Dogman was there waiting on the rock shelf or standing in the tree line at the edge of the hollow. Sometimes it wasn't, and those days felt flat and colorless. When it was there, they would sit at a distance from each other, usually 15 to 20 feet, and just exist in the same space. The distance closed gradually over months, measured in inches per week. By February, the gap was 10 feet. By April, it was 6. The witness brought food when he could. Raw meat mostly, sometimes canned tuna, whatever he could take from the house without raising questions. The Dogman sometimes brought things, too. A dead rabbit left on the rock shelf, still warm, placed deliberately in the spot where the witness usually sat. A fish once, a brook trout from the creek, still flopping on the rock when the witness arrived. The witness told me he laughed out loud at the fish, and the Dogman tilted its head in a way that made him laugh harder. That classic canine head tilt that looks like confusion but might be something else entirely. He said that was the first time he'd laughed in months. His parents had split by then. His mother had moved to her sister's house in Marlinton. His father drank on the porch in the evenings and didn't ask where he went after school. The house was full of silence and anger and the smell of stale beer. And here was this impossible creature in the woods behind his house, bringing him a fish like a cat bringing a gift to its owner. Except the creature weighed probably 400 pounds and could have pulled a tree out of the ground with its bare hands. I personally think this is where the story gets really interesting from a research perspective. because what the witness described over the following months and years does not match any Dogman behavioral model I've encountered in over a decade of covering this subject. I've spent years studying reports. I've talked to hundreds of witnesses across multiple states. I've read every credible database entry I can find. The consistent theme is fear. Dogman encounters are defined by terror, aggression, territorial behavior, and predatory intent. The Dogman stalks. The Dogman chases. The Dogman stands at the edge of the tree line and makes you feel like prey. That is the standard model. What this witness described was none of those things. The Dogman showed what I can only call social behavior. It recognized him individually and responded to his presence differently than it would have to any other human. It adjusted its body language in his company, relaxing postures that it held rigid in other contexts. It demonstrated what appeared to be curiosity, playfulness, and something that functioned like affection. Though I'm cautious about projecting human emotional frameworks onto a creature we barely understand. By the time the witness was 16, the dynamic had shifted from cautious coexistence to something more active. The Dogman would walk with him through the woods, not beside him the way a dog walks with its owner, but parallel, usually 20 to 40 feet away, moving through the brush with a silence that still amazed him even after years of observation. The Dogman's feet fell without sound on leaves that should have crunched. Branches that should have snapped simply bent out of its way, or the Dogman flowed around them with a fluidity that looked effortless. The Dogman knew the forest better than he did, better than his father did, better than anyone who had ever lived on that land. It knew where the ground was soft, where the deadfalls were, where the springs ran and where the ground wasps nested. It would sometimes stop and wait for him at points where the terrain was difficult, standing upright on a ledge or a ridge, and watching with what he described as patience until he caught up. He told me it felt like being escorted, like the Dogman understood that he was slower and more fragile and less capable on that terrain, and adjusted its pace to accommodate him without making a display of it. There were seasons that stood out to him, summer evenings when the fireflies came up from the creek bottom, and the Dogman would sit in the clearing, and the tiny lights would drift around its massive dark form like sparks. October afternoons when the canopy turned golden orange, and the Dogman moved through the fallen leaves without disturbing them, while he crunched through them like a marching band behind it. Winter mornings when fresh snow showed tracks on the ridge, the Dogman's prints impossibly large beside the trail where deer had passed, and he'd follow them to wherever the Dogman was waiting. Each season added another layer to something that had no name and no category, but was as real as the ground under his feet. As I covered in my video about Dogman intelligence, there is growing debate in the research community about the cognitive capacity of these creatures. Are they animals operating on instinct, or is there something more complex happening behind those eyes? This story pushes hard toward the latter interpretation, and I think that's part of what makes it so difficult for some researchers to accept. If Dogmen are capable of individual recognition, social bonding, and behavioral modulation across years-long relationships, then we are not dealing with an animal in any conventional sense. We are dealing with something that forces us to redraw the line between human and non-human intelligence, and that is a line most people are not comfortable redrawing. I asked the witness directly whether the Dogman ever frightened him after that first encounter. He thought about it for a long time. He said once, when he was about 17, he came to the woods and found the Dogman standing over the carcass of a white-tailed deer it had just killed. The deer's neck was broken and the rib cage was opened. The Dogman's muzzle was dark with blood and its eyes had a different quality, something primal and focused and utterly foreign that he had not seen before. He said he stopped walking 30 feet away and the Dogman looked up at him, and there was a moment, maybe 2 seconds, where he saw what everyone else who encountered a Dogman described: the raw physical power, the predatory intelligence, the absolute certainty that this creature could end your life without effort and without remorse. He felt his knees go weak and his vision narrowed, and every cell in his body screamed at him to run. Then the moment passed. The Dogman's posture softened. Its ears came forward. It stepped away from the deer and sat down. He said it was like watching someone switch off a light. Whatever had been active during the hunt powered down the moment it recognized him. The predator went somewhere deep inside, and the creature he knew came back to the surface. He said that moment taught him something important. The dogman was both things simultaneously. It was a killer, and it was his friend. Those two realities existed in the same body, and neither one canceled the other. He told me about dozens of encounters over the years that followed. The dogman waiting at the tree line when he came home from school, its dark shape visible against the gray bark of the beeches. The dogman sitting on the ridge above the property during summer thunderstorms, silhouetted against the lightning, rain streaming down its fur while it seemed utterly unbothered by the noise and the light. The dogman once carrying a fawn in its arms, that it set down near the creek and then backed away from, as if it had found the orphaned animal and didn't know what else to do with it. The witness couldn't tell if that was compassion or confusion. He said the line between the two was blurrier with the dogman than it was with any human he'd ever known. And then there was the physical contact. The dogman touching his outstretched hand once, just once, pressing the pad of its palm against his fingers in a moment that lasted maybe 3 seconds, but that he described as the most significant physical experience of his life. He said the skin was hot, much hotter than human skin, and rough like the pad of a large dog's paw, but thicker and harder, almost like calloused leather. The dogman's claws were retracted or folded back when it made that contact. He believed the dogman understood what the claws meant in the context of touch, and deliberately made itself safe for him. I have covered hundreds of stories on this channel, and I have never heard another witness describe anything remotely like that. I actually visited the property. The witness allowed me to come out for one afternoon, and I want to tell you about that because it matters. The hollow looks exactly the way he described it. The creek runs clear over sandstone, and the rhododendron closes in like walls on either side. The fallen oak is still there, though it has settled deeper into the rock shelf and the bark is mostly gone. I stood in the spot where a 14-year-old kid sat down 6 feet from a wounded dogman, and I tried to imagine what that took. I could not imagine it. I've been obsessed with these creatures since I was a kid myself, and I still don't know if I could have done what he did at 14. The forest was quiet the day I was there. No birds for a stretch that made the hair on my arms stand up. The witness watched me notice the silence and nodded like he'd been expecting my reaction. He said it was always like that in the deep part of the hollow. He said the dogman's presence changed the acoustic profile of the forest, that animals knew to be quiet in its territory, and that the silence had remained even after the dogman was gone, as if the forest itself hadn't gotten the message yet. I stood there in that silence for a long time, and I understood in a way I hadn't before why this man had kept coming back for 20 years. That hollow felt different. It felt like a place where something important had lived. The witness graduated high school in 2007. He got a job at a lumber mill in the next county. He moved into a trailer on the family property, paying his father a small rent so he could stay close to the woods. He told me that every major life decision he made between the ages of 14 and 34 was influenced by the need to stay near the dogman. He turned down a partial scholarship to a community college 2 hours away. He ended a relationship with a woman who wanted to move to Charleston. He bought the trailer instead of saving for something better because the trailer was close to the hollow, and the hollow was where the dogman was. The dogman was the center of gravity in his life, and everything else orbited around it. He told me he knew how that sounded. He told me he didn't care. A lot of you have asked me after previous videos whether I think dogmen are capable of complex emotion. I have always been careful in how I answer that, because I don't want to project human feelings onto something we don't fully understand. But this witness forced me to reconsider my caution. He described a relationship that evolved and deepened over 20 years. The dogman aged during that time. Its muzzle grayed steadily from the tip backward. Its movements slowed. the explosive quickness he'd seen in the early years giving way to a more measured, deliberate locomotion. The limp from the trap injury became more pronounced as the years passed, especially in cold weather when the witness said he could almost see the pain in the way the dogman favored the leg. The witness said he could track the passage of time through the dogman's body the same way you track time through the face of someone you love. He noticed when the gray first appeared. He noticed when the dogman stopped climbing to the higher ridges. He noticed when the distance between their sitting spots closed to nothing. Not because he had moved closer, but because the dogman had, as if the caution of its younger years had simply worn away with age and familiarity. And yes, he used the word love. He said it quietly, almost apologetically, as if he expected me to laugh or to tell him he was projecting. I did not laugh. I sat with the weight of that word and tried to understand what it meant in a context that has no precedent in any literature I've ever read. The photograph started in 2011. The witness had saved enough from the lumber mill to buy a decent camera. Nothing professional, a consumer-level DSLR that he taught himself to use from YouTube tutorials. He told me it took months of carrying the camera into the woods before the dogman tolerated the sound of the shutter. The first time he pressed the button, the dogman vanished into the brush so fast he didn't even see it move. He spent weeks after that just carrying the camera without using it, letting the dogman get accustomed to its presence as an object. Then he started clicking the shutter at random without pointing it at anything, desensitizing the dogman to the sound the way you desensitize a nervous horse to a plastic bag. The first usable photos came 6 months later, taken at distance, 60 or 70 feet. The dogman partially obscured by brush and branches. They were blurry and dark, and they were still better than 90% of the alleged dogman photographs in circulation. Over time, as the dogman grew accustomed to the camera, the distance closed. The photos from 2015 and 2016 are remarkable. The dogman sitting in a clearing with dappled light filtering through the canopy. The dogman standing against an autumn tree line, the leaves gold and orange and red behind its dark form. The contrast between the warm colors of the forest and the creature's dark silhouette, creating an image that looks almost painterly. And then the photos that stopped me cold when the witness showed them to me on his phone during our third conversation. Him and the dogman together, crouching side by side in the fallen leaves, the camera on a self-timer, propped on a stump 20 feet away, his arm resting against the dogman's massive forearm as casually as if he were posing with an old friend. The dogman's posture relaxed, its head slightly tilted, its amber eyes looking directly at the lens. They look like old friends posing for a picture on a hiking trip, except one of them has a canine head and claws and stands over 7 feet tall and is not supposed to exist. I have seen a lot of alleged dogman evidence in my years doing this. Most of it is blurry, ambiguous, shot at distances that make identification impossible, easily dismissed by skeptics as misidentified bears or elaborate hoaxes. These photos are not blurry, they are not ambiguous, they show something that should not exist, and they show it clearly, in natural light, with a human scale reference standing right beside it. I personally think they are among the most significant pieces of dogman evidence in existence, and the witness has allowed me to use a selected few in this video, with his explicit approval. I want you to look at them carefully. Look at the body language. Look at the proximity. Look at the ease between them. That is not a man standing next to a creature he fears. That is a man standing next to something he has known for half his life. The witness got married in 2019. His wife knew he spent time in the woods but did not know why. She assumed it was just his way, the habits of someone who'd grown up rural and solitary. He told me the secret ate at him constantly, a low-grade anxiety that never fully went away. There were nights lying in bed when he almost told her. There were mornings he came back from the hollow smelling like forest and musk and something she couldn't identify, and she would ask where he'd been, and he would say he was checking the property line or walking the creek looking for ginseng. He hated lying to her. It was corrosive, but he was terrified that telling the truth would end either his marriage or the dogman's safety. Because if she told anyone, if word got out, Hunters and researchers and camera crews would descend on that hollow and destroy the only safe space the Dogman had ever known. He could not risk either outcome. So he carried it alone, the way he had carried it since he was 14 years old. And the weight of it showed in his face and in the careful, measured way he chose his words when he spoke to me. In the fall of 2022, the witness went to the woods and the Dogman was not there. This was not unusual. There were stretches of days, sometimes a couple of weeks, when the Dogman was absent, presumably ranging through the deeper hollows and high ridges that made up its wider territory. The witness would leave food at the rock shelf and check back the next day, and the food would be gone, and he would know the Dogman was nearby even if he hadn't seen it. But this time, the food sat untouched for a week, then 2 weeks, then a month. The witness told me the dread built like water rising behind a dam. He started hiking farther into the forest than he ever had, past the second ridge, past the third, into country so steep and choked with laurel and deadfall that progress was measured in yards per hour. He called for the Dogman, something he'd never done before because he'd never needed to. The Dogman had always been there. The forest swallowed his voice and gave back nothing. He searched through the winter of 2022 into 2023, every weekend, sometimes after work in the dark with a headlamp, stumbling through frozen creeks and over ice-slicked rocks. He told me he lost 15 pounds he couldn't afford to lose. He told me his wife thought he was having an affair because of how often he disappeared and how wrecked he looked when he came home, his clothes torn, his hands scratched raw, his eyes red from exhaustion and from something else she couldn't identify. He couldn't explain. He couldn't even begin to explain. He just kept searching. He covered every drainage, every ridge, every sheltered hollow within a 5-mile radius of the property. He found old tracks that had frozen in the mud weeks earlier. He found a marking on a tree, claw gouges at a height of about 7 feet that looked months old and weathered. He found nothing alive. In February of 2023, on a ridge about 4 miles from the property, farther than he'd ever tracked the Dogman before, he found what he had been afraid of finding. The Dogman was lying in a shallow depression beneath a rock overhang, a natural shelter on the north face of the ridge where the wind didn't reach, and the ground was covered in dry leaves. The body was curled on its side, the injured leg tucked underneath, the head resting on one arm in a posture that looked like sleep. The fur had thinned and lost the luster he remembered from the early years. The muzzle was almost entirely gray, the dark fur faded to silver. There were no wounds that the witness could see, no signs of violence or confrontation or disease, no blood, no trauma. The Dogman had simply gotten old, older than anyone knows these creatures live, and had come to this quiet place alone to lie down for the last time. The witness sat beside the body for 3 hours. He told me this part of the story in fragments, with long silences between them where I could hear him breathing on the phone, and I could hear something in those breaths that I recognized, because I have heard it before in people who have lost someone they cannot replace. He described touching the fur on the Dogman's shoulder and feeling how cold it was, the heat that had always radiated from the Dogman's body completely gone. He described the stillness of the chest that had risen and fallen beside him 1,000 times over 20 years on that rock shelf in the hollow. He described the way the Dogman's face looked in death, the tension gone from the jaw, the ears relaxed flat against the skull, the eyes closed. He said it looked peaceful. He said that was the worst part because he was not peaceful at all. He was shattered in a way that he did not have language for, in a way that no one around him would ever understand because no one knew what he had lost. He buried the Dogman there on the ridge. It took him 2 full days of work. The ground was rocky and shot through with roots that fought him at every inch. He dug with a folding shovel in his bare hands, his fingers cracking and bleeding in the February cold, and he did not stop until the grave was deep enough that nothing would disturb it. He carried stones from the creek at the base of the ridge, making trip after trip up the steep slope with his arms burning and his back screaming, and covered the site with a cairn that looked like a natural rockfall to anyone who didn't know what was underneath. He did not mark it with a cross or a plaque or anything that would draw attention. He told me the Dogman had spent its entire life hiding, and he was not going to betray that in death. When he was done, he sat on the stones with his back against the rock overhang and talked to the Dogman for the last time. He told it about his wife. He told it about the scholarship he'd turned down. He told it that the fish was still the funniest thing he'd ever seen in his life. He told it that he didn't regret a single day. Then he walked home and put the shoebox of photographs on a shelf in the back of the garage and did not open it for a year. I think about this story constantly. I've been obsessed with it since the first conversation. I think about what it means for our understanding of Dogman behavior and what it means for our understanding of ourselves. We build categories for the things we encounter: animal, human, monster, friend. We assume those categories are stable, that the walls between them are solid and permanent. This story dissolves those walls entirely. It suggests that in the hollows and ridges of Appalachia, in the places where the forest still belongs to itself and human influence fades to nothing, the boundaries between species are more permeable than we want to believe. A creature we classify as a cryptid, as a monster, as a thing to be feared and fled from, was capable of trust, of loyalty, of a bond that lasted 2 decades and shaped the entire trajectory of a human life. I am not saying every Dogman encounter is like this. The evidence overwhelmingly says otherwise. Most Dogman encounters are terrifying. Most Dogman display territorial aggression, consistent with a large apex predator defending its domain. I have covered enough of those stories on this channel to know that fear is the default response to these creatures for very good reason. But I've also been doing this long enough to know that consistency is not the same as universality. There are outliers in every dataset. There are exceptions to every behavioral model, and sometimes those exceptions are the most important data points of all because they show us the edges of what we thought we knew and force us to expand the map. The witness told me one more thing before we ended our final conversation. He said he had nightmares now, but they were not the nightmares you would expect. He did not dream about the Dogman attacking him. He did not dream about being chased through the woods or cornered in the hollow. He dreamed about the forest behind his house, empty and silent, the way it had been since that February day on the ridge. He dreamed about walking the old paths past the creek and the rock shelf and the fallen oak and finding nothing at the end of them, just trees and leaves and the sound of water over stones and the absence of something that had made those woods feel alive for 20 years. He said the absence was worse than any fear he had ever felt, worse than the first day when he'd stood in front of a Dogman with a steel trap on its leg and no weapon and no plan and no idea what was going to happen next. He said fear had a shape you could push against. It was a wall. It had edges. You could brace yourself and fight it. Grief was just space where something used to be, and no matter how many times you walked through that space, it never filled back in. I sat with that for a long time after he said it. I think it is the most honest thing anyone has ever told me about what it means to encounter something that is not supposed to exist, and then to lose it. We talk about Dogman sightings as events, as discrete moments that happen and then end, and become stories to tell around campfires, or on channels like this one. We rarely talk about what comes after. We rarely consider that some encounters don't end at all, that they become relationships, and that relationships carry the full weight of human experience, including love and loss and the kind of quiet devastation that no one else can understand because no one else was there. I do not know what the Dogman was. I do not know where it came from or how old it was, or how many others like it might still be moving through the deep hollows of Appalachia right now as you listen to this. I do not know if the bond this witness described was unique or if it has happened before in places where no one kept a record and no one ever will. I do know that I have spent over a week since my last conversation with this man going back through every Dogman database I have access to, looking for any parallel, any other report that hints at sustained, non-aggressive contact between a Dogman and a human being. I found 3 possible cases, all fragmentary, all second-hand, None of them come close to the depth and duration of what this witness described. If this has happened before, the people involved kept it as secret as he did, and I cannot blame them. But I know what I saw in those photographs. I know what I heard in that man's voice across 9 hours of conversation. And I know that the story of a lonely 14-year-old kid and a wounded dogman in a West Virginia hollow is not the kind of story anyone would make up, because it is not the kind of story that makes you feel safe or certain or comfortable about anything. It is the kind of story that opens a door in your understanding and shows you a room you didn't know was there. And once you've seen it, you cannot unsee it, and you cannot close that door again no matter how hard you try. If you are watching this in Appalachia, or anywhere near the deep woods of the eastern mountains, pay attention to the forests behind your homes. Pay attention to the hollows and the ridges, and the places where the rhododendron grows thick enough to hide a world. Something lives in those spaces, something that is more complex, more intelligent, and more capable of connection than we have ever allowed ourselves to believe. And somewhere on a nameless ridge 4 miles from a family property in southern Pocahontas County, beneath a cairn of creek stones that no one will ever find, lies the body of a dogman that spent 20 years proving it. For more stories like this, consider subscribing.